located Suktiak Foodways at the Inuk Village site in Alaska.
Yeah. Hi everyone, my name is William Kennedy. I'm an undergraduate student and intern at the State University of New York at Cortland College's Sociology and Anthropology Department. Today I will be discussing the impacts that Russian colonization had on the Suktiak peoples of Alaska. We contextualize our data both within the Russian contact period as well as the pre-contact, pre-colonial, prehistoric, as some might like to call it. The findings presented here represent the ongoing work of the Old Harbor Archaeological History Project, as well as the excavations at Inuk Village in Kodiak, Alaska. Before I begin though, I'd like to give some acknowledgements first to the chairs of this symposium for allowing me to talk today. Secondly, the Suktiak and Alutiiq peoples of Old Harbor, as well as the Old Harbor Native Corporation for allowing us the opportunity to work with their ancestral lands and belongings. And then finally, SUNY Cortland's Undergraduate Research Fellowship, as well as the estate of Nancy A. Johnson. Without their funding for my travel and equipment, I would not have been able to participate in the 2025 research expedition last summer. To start us off, I've chosen this picture of Suktiak fishermen on a hunt for salmon taken in 1904. Traditionally, studies of colonialism in the Americas treat the arrival of Europeans, right, as this immediate, overwhelming, and transformative event. European colonization in Western accounts eclipses histories of indigenous peoples, relegating their past to this inconsequential prehistoric period. Instead of being active negotiators or historical participants, indigenous peoples are treated as passive victims of an inevitable European conquest. That's what makes a picture like this so significant, in my opinion. Here we see a group of Suktiak fishermen living well past the period of Russian colonization, while also subject to the rapid Americanization of Alaska, and they're still practicing their traditional ways of life. In this presentation, we argue that while still harmful to the Suktiak peoples, the Russian colonization of Alaska was not this overwhelming and erasing force, primed by significant environmental shifts, which occurred during the Little Ice Age. The Suktiak people were well equipped to adapt to significant lifestyle changes. While subsistence food preferences might have changed, the Suktiak people never assimilated to the Russian pressures. To continue on with this idea, I'd like to follow up with a quote by Anishinaabe author Gerald Fiesner, who coined the term survivance. He defined it as this active sense of presence, the continuation of native stories, not a mere reaction or a survival name. Native survivance stories are a renunciation of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. It is this idea of survivance which frames our research. The Suktiak people, despite the encroachment by the Russians and the Americans, still exist, they still speak their native languages, and they still practice their traditional ways of life. So to set the scene geographically, here's a picture of the Kodiak Archipelago. The superimposed gold star represents the modern location of the village of Old Harbor. If we zoom in a little bit further, right, we can see where our excavations have been taking place at Inuk KOD 114 at the former Inuk village site, and in relation to the village of Old Harbor. And here is drone photography of the site of Inuk today. The people at Inuk resided in these semi-subterranean houses built on the low-lying ridge, which is parallel to the this low-lying ridge right here, parallel to the beach line. In the late 1830s, around 1837, 1838, there was a devastating outbreak of smallpox, which significantly reduced the Suktiak population of the archipelago. In response, the Russians consolidated the remaining populations into 10 villages around Kodiak. Old Harbor is one of those 10 villages. Here's a digitized layout of KOD 114 Inuk Village, which is actually a stone's throw away from the Tanganak Spring site, which was just mentioned, which I thought was cool. As of 2025, there have been an identified number of 6 past house pit structures. The X marks house pit 2, as identified for KOD 114, and that's where the majority of excavations have been taking place. The eastmost house pit on this map is presumed to be a koski, where the unmarried men of the village would reside. So when we talk about survivance, I don't really want to understate things like Russian colonization and its maladaptive effects on the Sugpiaq people, right? Like with the mention of smallpox, the Russians were the people who introduced that, right? And beyond illness, the Russians were not afraid of using violence to enforce their control over the Sugpiaq peoples. One of the most notorious examples being that of the massacre of Awawuk by Commander Shelikov in the 1760s. The primary desires of the Russian enterprise during this period of time was the extraction of mammal furs. While the Russians had the motivations, they did not have the means of hunting these creatures, and so relied on the forceful conscription of Sugpiaq peoples to obtain these furs. So great was the demand for the Russian demand for furs, and so prevalent was overhunting that several species went extinct or extirpated during this period of time. As one might expect, this had cascading effects on the environment, as well as the subsistence abilities of the Sugpiaq peoples. Now, with the removal of the male population for long periods of time by the Russians, as well as the depletion of significant portions of the natural wildlife, one might expect to see the Sugpiaq supplement their diets either with untraditional food means, that being like the importation of Russian foodstuffs, as well as the implementation of domestic animal husbandry. Instead, when we look at the archaeological records, the excavation of midden sites at KOD 114, we don't really see either of those things taking place. So how can this be, right? Now, bear with me for a minute because I'm not exactly a climatologist, but I think it's important to look at some of the climate trends happening at this time and to try and make some inferences or implications. Up until the 1660s, we see globally this climate stability period happening within the Little Ice Age, where mean and variance in temperatures was very minimal, right? Maybe 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. Starting in the 1660s, however, about a century before the Russians arrived in Kodiak, there was the beginning of this wild variation in temperatures, leading to less productivity in the hunting environments and less predictable obtaining of food for the Sugpiaq peoples. By the time the Russians arrived in the 1760s, after having dealt with this for about a century, the Sugpiaq people would have developed a tradition of adapting, would have had the opportunity of developing this tradition of adapting to wildly unpredictable climate variations or other situations, implementing sufficient risk management strategies to hedge against particularly unfruitful seasons. In more detail, the climate topic relating to the Sugpiaq peoples and indigenous peoples is kind of beyond the breadth of this presentation, but if anyone's interested, I recommend going into The Little Ice Age and Colonialism, written by Hollis Miller and Ben Fitzhugh. It just goes into greater detail on this topic. Now, with that climate trend discussion, right, how does that square away with the archaeological evidence collected at Old Harbor, or at Inuk, KOD 114? One of the major sources of evidence collected by this project is faunal and zoo archaeological remains. What makes Inuk Village particularly important is the many well-preserved midden deposits present both outside of and within the house pits. Here's a picture of Yuan Shi, a member of the 2025 excavation team, looking over at an excavated 2 by 2 meter midden pit. You can clearly see the defined stratigraphical layers here, composed primarily of invertebrate shells, but also having various fish, bird, and mammal bones. This particular context was deposited during the Russian colonial period. Here's a pre-colonial midden deposit located within the confines of the house pit 2 at KOD 114, you can see the predominance here of fish bones, with also this vertebrae right here. And then finally, this was this was my first actual archaeological excavation, and so I wasn't really hopeful of finding anything super impressive, but in my opinion, we found something kind of really cool. So this is a pre-colonial, this is at the base of a pre-colonial pit feature, and this is a whale vertebra found, and not just a whale vertebra in itself, but also it has clear indications of human manipulation. It's been hollowed out so as to either be used as a bowl or mortar of some kind. I believe during the excavation project, someone humorously suggested that it might be a toilet for a child, but I don't know about that. In total, right, this project has collected over 1,000 pounds of faunal remains, with 871 identified mammal specimens. For fish that have been found within these contexts, we've quantified them by their found vertebrae, and we've found 1,903, and these have been separated between clearly salmonid or not salmonid species. Also, in totality, we found 78,000 grams of invertebrate remains, just because it's a little cooler than just saying 78 kilograms. But the birds are also present within these midden matrices, but there hasn't been much work done in analyzing or quantifying this amount of time. Somebody is working on this currently, but I can't really speak much on that at this time. So when we look at the, we actually dig into the contexts here, right? Looking at the pre-colonial period specifically, there's little dominance of shellfish and instead in fish varieties, particularly Pacific salmon. And there is a notable degree of mammal collection, specifically of northern fur seals. When we move over to the colonial period, the dominance switches to shellfish. When looking at the fish varieties, though, there's a high fish diversity. So not just Pacific salmon, but also marine and coastal fish varieties. Mammal hunting is kind of interesting, right? Instead of decreasing as we might expect with the overprevalence of hunting due to the Russian presence, instead what we see is an uptick in the presence of mammal species, specifically not just northern fur seals, but harbor seals and porpoises as well. But what's important to keep in mind, though, with the colonial period context is that there's no evidence of introduced foods. So the kind of inference or the conclusion that we're making specifically within the context of Inuk village is that during the Russian colonization of Kodiak, the Supiaq men were conscripted and employed to hunt marine mammals for the RIC for extended periods of time. With a significantly reduced labor pool, right, one might expect the Supiaq villages suffer the real possibility of starvation during these winter months. And we might have expected to see clear evidence of the adaptation of Russian foodways to supplement this, but instead what we see is this kind of business as usual for the Supiaq peoples. By this point in time, it would have been customary for the Supiaq to have gone on longer, for Supiaq men specifically to have gone on longer hunting expeditions, and in a similar capacity or vein to them being conscripted for long periods of time by the Russian-American company. So we expect to see that the Supiaq women would have been accustomed to these to this absence of men in the village by the Russian arrival, and would have been well used to supplementing their lack of food with more local food gathering things like the previously mentioned shells and invertebrates, right? What we see is this idea of support of the idea of indigenous survivance. We have the women of the villages being these kind of cultural torchbearers, maintaining the traditional ways of life of the Supiaq peoples up until like the 1840s, when the indigenous villages were reconsolidated into places like Old Harbor. But regardless of that, they were still able to assert and maintain their traditions and identities back both within the 1800s, and they continue to do so today. Thank you very much.